The Cold War is one of the most widely known periods in world history. Not only does it have extreme relevance to many of the global issues we face today, it contains some of the most important moments in global history, the creation of the nuclear bomb and the beginnings of the exploration of the new frontier, to name just a few.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
In our current recollection, we often view the Cold War as this ideological conflict that did not truly begin to thaw until the 1970s and 1980s. In my opinion, this is a fairly inaccurate assumption.
There you go again.
While the diplomatic relations between the United States and the Soviet Union had indeed drastically improved, there was one point where I truly believed that the Cold War could have been thawed and potentially could have caused more diplomatic cooperation much sooner. Enter the 1950s.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
I would argue that in the average analysis of the Cold War, the 1950s often get overlooked as the period between the beginning of the Cold War and the massive heightening of tensions that was the 1960s. The 1950s, I argue, was the most crucial decade in directing the path that the Cold War would take. I would like to do a very brief overview, and I mean brief, this is not a very long video, and is a very generalized overview, but it kind of highlights some of the most important moments of the 1950s, and an incident in particular that I believed truly shaped the path the Cold War would take. In the 1950s, there had been a drastic shift in the mindset of American and Soviet leadership. President Eisenhower, while many cite the CIA intervention in various nations around the globe to prevent the rise of communism, was a major advocate in the pursuit of peace with the Soviet Union. On the other hand, there was Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. And while many in the West viewed Khrushchev as this brash leader who vowed, "We shall bury you," this truly could be farther from who he actually was. Khrushchev, while viewed by many in the Soviet Union as an unintelligent Ukrainian peasant, was fairly wise when it came to understanding the gravity of the situation these two nations were in. In what is referred to as Khrushchev's thaw, Khrushchev was widely known as taking a stance of diplomacy and cooperation in deciding the differences between his nation and the United States. Eisenhower and Khrushchev had many crucial moments of diplomacy and negotiation. For example, the Geneva summit that occurred in 1955 was an extremely important moment in diplomatic relations between these two nations. This summit led to discussion regarding global cooperation and discussed the possibility of nuclear limitation. Later, in 1959, Khrushchev would visit the United States. This moment was a fairly significant show of possible peace, in a period where many around the globe feared the day where the bomb would be used again. This gave many around the world hope that peace and cooperation would prevail. A visit would also take place where former Vice President Richard Nixon would visit the Soviet Union, and a planned visit for Eisenhower to visit the USSR had been arranged. A planned summit in 1960 in Paris had been set up, and it was expected to address a nuclear test ban treaty, attempting to solve the issue of a divided Germany and what to do about the ever-devolving Cuba situation. However, in a twist of fate, an incident occurred that would set the Cold War back onto a possible path of devolving to nuclear conflict. In May of 1960, an American U-2 spy plane had been shot down over the Soviet Union. This incident was widely publicized and created a diplomatic crisis. Khrushchev quickly denounced the incident, and in a speech delivered to the Soviet Union just 4 days after the incident, Khrushchev had said that the possibility of peace and ending the Cold War was effectively a one-sided endeavor. It had appeared in the Soviets' eyes that peace may indeed be impossible. However, while Khrushchev was denouncing the incident, fear had begun to swirl in the Eisenhower administration. The Eisenhower administration was extremely afraid that Khrushchev would be removed from power. Now, I know this sounds strange, but allow me to explain. Remember that for years, the United States had to deal with the brash and difficult to work with Joseph Stalin. Khrushchev was very different, and for the first time, the US believed that they had found someone they could work with. However, in the wake of Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinization and liberalization and negotiations with the West, hardliner Soviets and politicians were outraged. Khrushchev was becoming more and more unpopular and faced being deposed from power, which in years later would indeed happen. although this is not relevant to the topic at hand. The Eisenhower administration feared that if too many Soviet politicians believed that Khrushchev's lighter policy in terms of relations with the West was directly responsible for the U-2 incident occurring, then it could be the end of any future negotiations with the USSR. Eisenhower had refused to apologize for the incident, and with the Paris summit just a few days away, it appeared to many that the summit had already failed, and indeed, it did. The summit would occur with very little negotiation or discussion between the US and the USSR. Khrushchev spent many of the moments ranting and raving over the perceived provocation by the United States. The summit concluded as if it never happened. Most of the topics were not discussed and everyone went home disappointed and frustrated. In the wake of the Paris summit, Eisenhower would leave office and John F. Kennedy would be elected. Kennedy would endure some of the most dire and difficult moments of the Cold War and saw the true possibility that nuclear annihilation could take place. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But had the U-2 incident not occurred, and the Paris summit concluded with the original plan taking place, there's a great possibility that the diplomatic improvements of the 1950s could have possibly prevented the dangerous climate of our 1960s from occurring. This brief overview of the 1950s diplomatic situation is extremely oversimplified, but in my opinion demonstrates the true possibility that peace could have been attained. In history, there is always much more behind these so-called critical moments or critical periods, and I'm not naive to say that this is 100% the factual truth. I'm just speculating. Context is always necessary, and this is just a brief overview. In my opinion, this entire period was an extremely crucial moment that effectively determined the next decade and a half of the Cold War. The 1950s and the U-2 spy plane incident specifically are a period and topic that I feel deserve more analysis. Besides the brief analysis and overview that you get in high school regarding the U-2 incident, there's very little talk about how much it affected US and Soviet relations. Again, what I've given here is just a sort of light overview and my belief and kind of brief synopsis of the situation, and I think that we need to kind of pay more service to how big of a deal this really was. This kind of inspiration for this video came from me currently writing a 20-page research paper for a history class that I'm currently taking in college. My topic is the U-2 spy plane incident and how it affected US-Soviet relations, and in my research and collection of primary and secondary sources, and I realized how little modern sourcing there is about this incident and period. Much of the sources I have to use are from the 80s and 90s, and we're in the 2020s now. So a lot has come to light over the decades, and a lot of new evidence and documentation has come to be accessible to historians, but yet it seems that no one really wants to touch this topic, and I feel like it's constantly gets overlooked by its importance. Now, you can always say that history is not built up of, one moment, but a collection of moments, context, and I agree that is very true, but there always are those moments that are kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, or those moments that are the culmination of tension in several other moments, and I believe that this one was one of them. So I really think this is a topic and a period that could use more historical analysis, and just I think we should talk about it more. Whether you agree with me or disagree, I'd love to hear your opinion, and any kind of other context or clarification that anyone would love to provide. I encourage that, and hopefully this can create a valuable discussion and conversation. In closing, my final kind of comment here is, if the U-2 spy plane had not happened, I truly believe that the world could have looked very different. However, again, I can only speculate. I would like to thank you all for watching. Thank you. If you have not already, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and have a wonderful rest of your day. I squeeze cat, 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 till my clip is empty, till my